welcome everybody to First Friday with Tiffany Tsao, editor of The Circular. My name is Julia Silas. I'm the Program Director at Writing New South Wales. Before we start, I'd like to go over some technical aspects. Your mics will be off for the whole event to ensure the best sound quality. Let us know in the chat if you're having any trouble hearing myself or Tiffany, or if you're having any technical difficulties, and we'll do our best to help. When in doubt, the best possible solution is to exit the Zoom meeting and then try to rejoin from the link in your email. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, we invite you to do that via the chat as well. We'll take as many of your questions as we can at the Q&A at the end of the event. Please feel welcome to chat to your fellow attendees throughout. We're recording this event, so if you do drop out or have to leave early, you can always watch it later on our website. So I'd like to start this event by acknowledging the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation on whose lands Writing New South Wales is situated. I pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands where you're joining us from today. So please feel free to make your acknowledgement of country in the chat box if you would like to do that. And so now I'm delighted to introduce today's guest, Tiffany Tsao. Tiffany is a writer and literary translator. She's the author of the Odd Fit fantasy series and The Majesties, which was originally published in Australia as Under Your Wings and was longlisted for the Ned Kelly Award. She has translated 5 books from Indonesian into English. Her translation of Norman Erickson Pasarabu's Happy Stories Mostly was the winner of the 2022 Republic of Consciousness Prize and was longlisted for the Booker Prize. Her work, her translation work was awarded a Penn Translate grant and shortlisted for the New South Wales Premier's Translation Prize. So welcome, Tiffany. We're really pleased to have you here today.
Oh, no, really glad to be here. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you. So even from your bio, you can see that there's a great range in the work that you've done. But I'd like to start sort of from earlier in your career. We will, so everybody knows, we'll be spending quite a bit of time talking about Tiffany's work as editor on The Circular, but we'll also be discussing the work that she did in leading up to that role, because it's really interesting. That's why, and it's an interesting career trajectory. So, Tiffany, prior to working in the publishing world, you received a PhD in English literature from the University of California, Berkeley, a very impressive thing in and of itself. And then you went to work as a lecturer at the University of Newcastle. Did you start out your sort of academic studying career thinking that you would become an academic?
Yes, actually, and that was why I embarked on a PhD. My sole goal at the time was to become an academic. Yes, and then things didn't work out that way.
Well, they did for a little while.
Yes, they did for a little while, but I think the working conditions were too uncertain. So after my contract ended at the University of Newcastle, decided to just quit. It's too demoralizing for far too long. I think to have such, I had an immense amount of teaching to do in addition to research expectations, and yeah, and it was just very difficult not having job certainty or sort of a consistent supportive environment.
And did you go into it thinking that that you would mainly be doing research, like that the balance would be primarily research with a bit of teaching? Is that how was that your expectation?
Actually, I didn't mind I think it just, sorry, this is getting really into the weeds right now, but I think it had to do just the differences between within the US, what is a teaching research balance, what is a good balance, and then coming to Australia and being a casual or a fixed term lecturer, and um, there being very different expectations around the amount of teaching and the work associated with teaching that you're expected to do, especially when you're trying to, sort of prove yourself as a younger academic or a,
Mm.
early career academic. You know, and you're more susceptible to saying, yes, sure, I can do that, and then yes, sure, I can do that, and then pretty much after that, you're like, I can't do any of this. It's very heavy. But that was around the time when I began writing my novel as well, my first novel.
Right,
Which took
right.
8 years to write in total, just for because of revision and all of that.
So my understanding was that after leaving University of Newcastle, you moved into translation. Is that, did I follow that correctly?
Yeah, that's correct.
So you were doing that and also writing your novel at the
Yeah.
same
Um,
time?
yeah. So the novel actually, I'd written it, and it was just a matter of sort of constantly revising it because, as people know, and I've taught courses for writing New South Wales, and
Yes.
met so many writers who are in the same boat. You write it, and then you go. Even when you've got most of it done, you're like, now what? Now what do I do? And then there's a time of querying, and then a time of thinking like, oh, maybe I should revise the manuscript. It's maybe I should revise it some more, and you sit on it, and so I think there's that limbo that can happen. So that had actually been ready to go for a while by the time I quit academia, and I did some more work on that. But when I quit academia, I was like, what do I do now? I have to find I have to find work that isn't academic, and that was pretty jolting because I had to basically switch mindsets from being so focused on being a successful academic and getting a continuing position somewhere to saying, now what do I do? So I applied for a lot of, I'd say not random, but different editor jobs in different sectors. I was pregnant at the time,
Mm.
so then I knew that there was also a time when I would be apparently non-high or not a what is it? Not an attractive hire, unfortunately, right?
Right, yeah.
And then yeah, and then at the time I was also I'd started being on the volunteer editorial staff of Asymptote, which is a online literary quarterly specializing in literary translation, and that's where I began to use the expertise I had gained in Indonesian literature and researching Indonesian literature um,
Ah.
in that capacity, and then I sort of began trying my hand at sample translations and
And
being
what drew you? I mean, you were working there and had an opportunity to experience it, but what drew you to the work of translation?
I think there were several aspects. I mean, one was because my heritage language is Indonesian,
Mm.
and I found myself, I mean, sorry, this sounds really snobby, but I found myself reading, some books in translation. And I would think like, this could be better translated, I feel.
Mm.
And that was just my sense of it. And I was very hesitant to enter the field at first, actually, but just because of the nature of my job. So I was the editor in charge of, they called it country editor. So I was the country editor for Indonesia at the journal. And my job was to sort of solicit and look for possibilities for publishing, in Indonesian literature or in our journal. And I was looking around and thinking like, oh well, this could be better, and then sort of started thinking like, oh, this would be really cool if we could translate this, and then looking for translators, and the journal didn't pay, so then that's another thing because then you have to say like, and would you like to do this for free or
Oh.
exposure, which in hindsight I was like, oh, what a terrible thing to ask. Of course, everyone was like, no. Or many people were like, no. I mean, it just depends. But yeah, so then I began sort of translating little things for their blog because they had a blog. And so I would say like, oh, this would be really nice to. And then I began to feel like I had a knack for it. And so what happened was 2015 was the Frankfurt Book Fair, and Indonesia was the market focus, the country
Mm.
market focus.
Mm.
That was the market focus there. And so my agent, who was representing my novel, said, I know you have background, Indonesian background. Do you know any writers from Indonesia that would be interesting that maybe I could represent for the book fair? And I said, oh yeah, I do. And then she said, would you mind, doing research, preparing some samples, and then we could, have you be the translator on those too. And so I was like, oh, that's great. So then I began sort of working there, and just really enjoying the work. So that's where it all started, and that's how I got the contracts as a translator for the first two books I translated, which are Paper Boats by Dee Lestari and The Bird Woman's Palette by Lakshmi Pamunchak.
Right. And I thought it's interesting when you said, because, you're translating Indonesian to English, and you said just then that Indonesian is your heritage language, which, I mean, it is very relevant for you to speak about which language you speak, because you do speak a number of languages, and it's not obvious that you would be translating from Indonesian to English, having that your background is very mobile, that you're born in the US, Chinese Indonesian heritage, lived in Singapore, lived in Indonesia. So even that you came to be deciding to work from Indonesian to English is not an automatic or obvious trajectory.
Mm-hmm. Yes, part of it was because my Mandarin is terrible, despite years and years and years of childhood tuition and studying at university. It's just a very hard language, I feel, to be fluent in, or it was for me. And Indonesian, I had more of that, because it's the language I heard more around the house, and that was more. It made more sense on a, I think, instinctual level. I have much better feel for the language than I would for Mandarin.
But then, I mean, it's quite one thing to have a feel for a language or be even fluent in a language. It's a whole other stage or a whole other level of expertise to be able to translate a work from one language into another. How did you, my understanding is it must be a very close relationship with the author of the original work. How does that relationship work?
It depends on the author. So some authors, prefer not to be bothered with translation matters, and some authors will get more involved. So I think it just depends on the author for that. Yeah. So there's that. Yeah, and then so I did brush up my Indonesian more at the graduate school level. And this was partly because for the PhD then in English, you were required to have either reading proficiency in 2 languages besides English or advanced proficiency in 1. And I was very lazy. And so I thought, oh, I'll just do Indonesian. That'll be my advanced proficiency language because it'll be easier. So it was sort of a reverse thing for me. I'd say moving from having it be a language that, I don't know, I have more of an intimate connection with, to then learning the grammar, the structures, and all of that behind it. So it was sort of, I think, more of a reverse trajectory than you'd get from someone who starts learning the language formally and doesn't have any connection with the language, and then moving into the space where they can probably feel a bit more intimate and at home with the language. So it's sort of reverse.
And sort of even within that, you have translated poetry as well, and I'm not sure. I know it's Norman Erickson Passarabu's poetry collection, and perhaps I'm unfamiliar. Perhaps you've translated other poetry as well, but that must be even another level of translation.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I ended up working so closely with Norman on their poetry, because I was very nervous actually. And I said, Norman, I don't usually translate poetry. I don't feel as comfortable translating poetry as I do with prose. And they were very, said, no, I want you to translate. I'm absolutely sure. Let's work on it together. And so that's why we did work so closely on that particular poetry collection.
So, I mean, I imagine writing your own work and translation must be a very, very different experience. what do you find for you is the difference between your writing your own work and translating another person's work?
Oh, yeah, I'd say when you're translating, you have something there. So I'd feel like it's almost like more like solving a, not solving, well, kind of solving a crossword puzzle or something, like trying to rearrange the pieces. You know what's there.
Mm.
I feel like writing, my own writing is it's a bit bewildering at first. Like I'm just starting on this new, my next novel, and I'm like, where do I even start? You know, do I start here? Do I start here? Like it's everything is completely blank.
Yeah.
So in a way, for me, translation is almost, I don't want to say easier, but it's more comforting because you have the product and you know it's good, right?
Mm.
Especially if you know you love the work that you're translating. You're like,
Mm.
this is exciting. It's just a matter of taking this and rendering it into this different language. But you know, with your own work, you're like, is this going to be good at all? I have no idea.
And so then in talking about writing your own work, is that something that you had always, I mean, I mean, obviously you were written as an academic, but in writing fiction, is that something that you had always been interested in doing?
Yes, so absolutely. So even from young, I was always writing. I think this is a common thread with many writers. From young, they've always been writing something,
Yeah.
even if it's like silly little stories or things like that, or you know, yeah. So my first novel, The Odd Fits, was actually the. I think I started writing it in. It must have been as an undergraduate. Yeah, I think that's when I started writing it.
And so the Odd Fits, and I haven't read the Odd Fits, but that's part of a fantasy series. Is that correct?
Yes, it's part of a fantasy trilogy that now we've taken. We're in the middle of changing publishers, or I'm in the middle of changing publishers, and yes, and it's partly because there was a snafu with the third book, which would have been the last book, and I really wanted to write it, and the publisher who had acquired it then sort of changed their policy. So because it's written originally in English and the publisher, Amazon Crossing, is a translation imprint technically. So the editor who acquired my work thought that, what is it? She really liked it so much that she just acquired it, even though it was an English language original. Then her boss changed, and then they were like, you can't acquire any more English language original books. And she's like, oh. So then
Too
it was a bit
late.
difficult because then I was all ready to write the third one. She's like, oh, there's just been some technical difficulties. And then after a while, it became apparent, like, oh, they can't acquire it. So then we had to take the rights back, and that be so that I could write the third one. But then by that time, I was like, what if there is no home for the third one? But I really felt I wanted to finish the whole series and was very excited about finishing it. And then the pandemic happened. Anyway, so then it's finished, but now all three books need to find a new publisher. Sorry, that's a very long story.
Well, I hope that they do.
Yes, me too.
I really hope they do, because I've recently come back from a week's holiday, and I had the great pleasure on that holiday of reading. I read the ebook edition of Under Your Wings, which was originally published in Australia, but now has been published as The Majesties. And I'm always very, I spend a lot of time thinking about what books I'm going to take away with me. And then I always have backups in case, I don't like one of the books that I've taken. And I knew that I needed to read your book, and I was sort of approaching it a bit as, okay, well, this is a duty that I need to be prepared for interviewing Tiffany. And so I wasn't feeling excited the way that I would normally feel about reading a book. It is absolutely brilliant. It is such a fabulous, it's really quite, for me, I found it quite a quirky book. It's like, it's this mixture of so many different things. And I also feel like when I've told anyone about it, I'm always a little bit worried I'm going to spoil something, because it's, it's quite a compact book, and there's so many interesting elements in it, I wouldn't want to give some of the fabulous things away. I think a really great way for people to get a sense of how good and how unusual a book it is for you, Tiffany, to read the opening paragraph, because I think that gives a better job than of reading the synopsis of it. I think this kind of crystallizes the elements of the book.
Oh, okay. She said as if it hadn't been, she hadn't prepared before.
Well,
Thank you for the kind words about the book. I was not expecting such kind words.
Well, we hadn't, I said when we were thinking about having this conversation, obviously it was going to be focused on the circular and you know, and I wanted to touch on other things that you had done. But then when I read the book, it was like, well, I think we have to talk about this for a bit longer than I had planned.
Oh. Okay, yeah, so this is the opening paragraph of Under Your Wings, or The Majesties, as it is otherwise known. And this paragraph took a lot of work. My editor and I worked quite a lot on this paragraph just to get it just right. When your sister murders 300 people, you can't help but wonder why, especially if you were one of the intended victims. Though I do forgive her, if you can believe it. I tried my best to deny the strength of family ties when everyone was still alive, but now I realize the truth of the cliche. Blood does run thick, even if poison trumps all.
I think that paragraph is an example of when they say that you know, the opening paragraph is sort of the make or break of a book, and this one makes the book. It as in that it draws you in to want to read more. It's beautifully succinct. It has the themes that then are followed through the book. It's a very finely crafted opening paragraph.
Oh, thank you.
So look, I encourage everyone to read it because it is such a great read. And this is the cover of The Majesty, because I read it on an ebook. I don't have a beautiful book to show you, but I wanted to show this cover because it is a beautiful image, and I hope people can get a sense of it on the small screen. And Tiffany, you were saying that it's painted by...
Oh yes, so the artwork, so the cover design was by James Jacobelli, but then the artwork featured in it is by someone named Joseph Lee. And so he's actually, when I found out about who he was, I was like, oh, it's too hip for my book, because like he's an artist slash actor. So, you know, like he's a very like well-known artist. And then it turns out he's also the supporting actor on that movie Searching. Yeah, so
That's too many talents.
I know. I was like, wow, he's too hip. And then, you know, so obviously then he's like, you know, putting I guess the cover on like on Instagram, and I'm like, oh, it's like, I don't know, like celebrity promo or something.
Well, I think it does prove that point of, you know, having a great book cover, you know, really does draw you into it. And that's exactly what this book cover does. It catches your eye and draws you into the book. So you've done well with that.
As if I had a hand in it.
Well, well, somehow you did. So look, I don't want to give a full synopsis of the book, but it is a really interesting combination of a sort of this sort of a gothic family novel of intrigue and a thriller, but then it also covers social and cultural issues, and at the same time as addressing really important and difficult issues of class and stereotype and race. It does it in a very witty and fast-paced way. Like it really moves along. It does. There's no weighing you down in the book. So I'm interested. Like, where did the idea for the book come from for you?
Hmm. So interestingly enough, it started actually, I guess, more of as an abstract concept, and then it sort of became apparent that I had to set it um, in something in a socio-political political historical context. So the original concept was basically the idea of family secrets, and I wanted to have the structure of the book be basically a woman finding out about the secrets in her family and about her family's life and sort of digging up one after another. So an excavation, but sort of a relentless excavation. So one after one excavation, all of a sudden there's more and there's more and there's more. So that's why the book is structured the way it is, right? It starts out with the narrator in a coma and trying to figure out why her sister would, murder her whole family and friends and all of that. So, but then to do that while I was writing, I actually didn't anticipate necessarily at first the Chinese Indonesian aspect coming up so much, but because the way the book was and the way it was so intimate, and when I was writing, I realized that, in some sense, right? What did Faulkner say? Like something like this: human experience is universal, but we all write what we know. So it's grounded in something. And that's what he would say when people asked him why he wrote about the South, because he's from the South. And so it became apparent to me that, I could set this in a family that maybe was not so closely culturally related to my family. Like Singaporean Chinese is also something I'm a bit more familiar with. And that's what I was initially intending. But I realized that actually, because my family is Chinese Indonesian, my mother's side is Chinese Indonesian, who's lived in Singapore for some time. And so there are these differences in the way people interact, the way family members interact. So it's sort of embedded. So then the question was, how do I write such an intimate story about a family without having those intimate details that I would otherwise be sort of just not making up, but, almost guessing at. And then it became apparent to me that I had to set it, if I wanted that feeling of intimacy within a Chinese Indonesian cultural context, which is what I'm most familiar with. And then from there, it became a question of, realizing there were all these other issues that I wanted to deal with in terms of, the Chinese and their position in Indonesia, position of, like apparent monetary privilege, but also that being the result of, a very specific colonial situation that, colonialism brought over. And this is true in a lot of Southeast Asia, right? Where the Chinese were positioned sort of as the middlemen, the traders, the merchants. And then the result of that being, right, the apparent look of wealth, right? So many individuals got very wealthy. But then you have a whole bunch of people of that same race who did not, or, who are then scapegoated for that as a result. So I just wanted to also treat that very complex situation also in the novel.
And there are many complex things that you're unpacking. And what I found, and there were things that, that I didn't know about in terms of the race riots in Indonesia against the Chinese. I did not know about that. And then, this fabulous way you unpacked the different Western stereotypes and I mean, I found that incredibly enlightening. But then it's all done in this book, which is these sort of heavy subject matters done in this incredibly light, entertaining book. So I think you have achieved something quite remarkable there, of which I would like to talk about for a very long time. But I feel like I now need to move us on to the circular. Let's now discuss the circular, the project that you've been working on for the last year. It was an initiative of the Sydney Review of Books, which is an online literary journal led by Katrina Menzies-Pike, and it was funded by the Australia Council. Tell us about what the Circular is and what was the intention of starting this project.
Yeah, so the Circular was started, and actually the concept for it was conceived before I came on board. I just sort of happened to come on board. But the idea for it was, what it does is it's a weekly email newsletter, actually primarily email, that keeps the best, useful, and most surprising Australian nonfiction in circulation. And I think the idea behind it was just to be sort of an aggregator, kind of like Griffith Reviews Great Reads, right? They put it out every week, or what is it, Arts and Letters Daily, or, or LitHub, like they'll sort of, but LitHub's aggregator model. So things that, they think are interesting reads, or good reads, or Goodreads, that term is now spoiled forever. Goodreads, like just interesting reads that often, that don't necessarily keep in circulation just because of the way things work online, right? So social media algorithms favor very certain kinds of writing, certain kinds of nonfiction. So what is, I guess, provocative, or provoking outrage, or perhaps just more flashy, right? Not necessarily just those. Not to diminish anything that goes viral. Like there's amazing work that like you discover because like, oh, like 7,000 likes, okay. But so there's like quieter writing that maybe is still very good or goes unrecognized, or sometimes pieces get published and for no reason at all, even though it's really good, even though people like it's a great read, like it'll somehow just get lost, and it's just a way, a project to just say that there's so much amazing writing, amazing nonfiction of all forms out there, and we want to keep people reading it and draw people's attention to it.
And the focus was on nonfiction, but it's Australian writers and writing. And in the context of the Circular, what did you mean by that? Because that's it's a clear term, but it's also a vague term.
Yes, and I guess, yeah, as editor, I've tried to keep it purposely vague. So we have we publish work from New Zealand writers as well. There's been pieces by writers who are Australian but living abroad, or I think we've published a few, or not, sorry, published, but sort of aggregated, collected a few pieces by people writing about Australia who are not necessarily Australian, but so things like that, but also just wanting to think more about diversity also, and not just repeat the same old, I'd say, boring narratives that we tend to have about what constitutes Australian writing, what makes Australian writer an Australian writer, and show that Australian writers are writing about all sorts of things. We've included pieces on Myanmar, on Hong Kong, because Australian writers are actually very diverse. So their focuses are on other things as well, not just Australian, stereotypical Australian topics.
And I mean, and I think another thing that is significant about how the Circular works is that it's a newsletter, or a list of articles that are recommended to have another look at, but it's curated by a person, which is, once again, seemingly, a person, big deal. But these days, it actually is a big deal that it's curated by a person, not an algorithm.
Yes, and that is a bit depressing when you think about it, but
it is.
It is. But it does show how recently, I mean, the Circular did do a survey of Australian literary organizations, and it is interesting to see like just how much we have become reliant, right? Even, I guess, editors at literary organizations on social media to just get a sense of what's being published and what's going on out there. And it's been really a great pleasure, actually, to be to have my job be look for cool things that people may not have found otherwise and put them in.
Yeah.
It's like really great. It's like being some sort of treasure hunter or something. Yeah.
I mean, I know that for me, there's a constant sense of being slightly sort of overwhelmed by how much there is out there that you want to read, should be reading, think you maybe should know about, but don't yet. But then when, I mean, I know when the circular came out, the fact that it felt like there was a person whose opinion I could trust. Yeah, yours. But that's very different. That is very different. It's like the difference between a friend telling you something's good or seeing it advertised on a billboard.
Yeah, and I think that's what we aim for, and that's why we have guest editors every now and then as well. And that's been really exciting because it's always so cool to see what the guest editor selects, and you can see just how differently people's brains work or where our focuses are. It's so interesting. Like every time we've had a guest editor, my mind has just been completely blown by what they selected. And I was like, oh, sometimes it's cool because like you're like, oh, they selected that piece. I'd been looking at that piece. It's been in my like little treasure chest for a while. But then you're like, oh, like I would have never found this piece. And I think there's that excitement when there is another person, right, a brain involved, right, in
Yeah.
bringing these selections together.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. And what things have you been surprised about discovering, like projects or articles that you have been in your research for the circular that you've discovered and were either surprised about or weren't aware of?
I think one thing that I've really enjoyed discovering is all of the littler projects that are out there, right? The literary projects, and the writing projects and the publications that I guess just diverge from the usual suspects because like it's no secret, right? Like in Australia, we think of like a few main publications, right? Sort of like the established ones, but there's so many other ones that are just really cool, and they seem to be just popping up. Like I've been at this job for almost a year now, and I'll find like a new one, and I'll be like, wow, that's so cool. Like for example, my most recent find is this bilingual online zine by Cantonese speaking artists and writers. And that's based in Australia, but it's actually, right, the focus is worldwide. So thinking of the Cantonese diaspora, I guess. And it's called Zo Matcha. I'll just type it in here.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah. And, just to discover something like that, right? And I think they just published their first issue last year, I think. But, just little projects like that may not necessarily, get the same, I guess, traffic or turn heads as well. There's one for Latinx writers, right? And I didn't know that existed until the editor, I think people think that when they send emails to the editor email address at the circular, they think it'll just go, into like some sort of slush pile. But actually it's just, me and I hardly get any emails apart from, the newsletters I subscribe to and for the circular and all of that. So like when I receive an email from a person, I'm like, oh, this is so exciting. So the editor of the Prentice Review reached out to me and said like, oh, do you mind publicizing our next, call for submissions where we accept nonfiction as well? And I was like, oh, look, I discovered this, like, so it's great. So it's funny, like, yeah, people should just write to me more and say, like, we're the so-and-so publication,
So is that's one of the things that's kind of surprised you in your role, like getting emails in your inbox from other people. Are there patterns that you have noticed in work that well, I suppose this is work that gets published and then work that doesn't reach, that doesn't perhaps reach an audience as readily?
Hmm. Um, I guess I have noticed that maybe there's certain patterns on the surface about writing in certain genres. So like
Mm.
one thing, as you'll know as a reader of the circular, one thing we've done is we have a theme-based approach. So
Mm.
we fell into that pattern, I think, around the third issue. Um, we basically have a general theme, very general.
Mm.
And then the pieces featured or linked to in that newsletter will, generally be in this theme. And it sort of enabled me actually to sort of see what, yeah, to think more about the way we categorize writing and what writing, and just like what pieces are often like when they fall into a certain category. Because sometimes
Mm.
it'll be very specific. Like so, for example, our the issue that's going out a little later today, and then the last week's issue is a double issue on food.
Mm.
And so I was
Mm.
looking around at a lot of articles, a lot of nonfiction pieces on food. And it was, for example, that was just interesting in itself to think like,
Mm.
oh, who writes what about food, right?
Mm.
And I think
Mm.
something that was interesting, well, to me, right, as someone of Asian background, is that a lot of I felt like, like when like a lot of writing. I mean, you can find like divergences, of course, but like the bulk of writing I could find about food and have, by people from Asian background or, from, writers of color had to do with like food and identity. And I thought that was just,
Mm.
just interesting to me, like
Mm.
saying like, what is it about the landscape, the climate, the society that moves us to write in this way about food and
Mm.
to write, in that mode where all of a sudden the food we consume is, becomes some sort of like a trope for our identity as well, right? And this
Mm.
very specific type of food. And this is interesting just because, my background is 1 foot, I guess, in Australia, US, sort of, I guess, Western countries, and then another is, because I grew up in Singapore and Indonesia, and like a a conversation I've had with writers, back home in Singapore and in Indonesia is like, why are diasporic writers so obsessed with food, and food is like, and it's
Yeah.
like, I mean, does that say that there are certain things, conditions where um, yeah, we end up writing about things in a certain way, or discouraged from writing things about it,
Mm.
writing, in other ways. So that's why in this upcoming issue, actually, that's coming out this afternoon, the first piece is it's one of the winners of the Diversity in Food Media Australia competition,
Oh.
one of the winning entries, and it's by Ange Sean Young, and it's about, she and her mother going out for pasta for like, a fancy Italian dinner. I just thought that, like that shouldn't be different. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm. Mm.
because you have so many like food pieces of on food written by, by white writers that are talking about like all sorts of foods. Why is
Mm.
this, why would this be um, unusual,
Mm. Mm.
and just the
But
fact that it is unusual kind of made me like annoyed at, the structures. And but I think, that is one thing, right? Sorry if I'm not being very clear, but like the themed approach has made me think more about who writes what and who is
mm.
encouraged to, or then is pressured just by the, environment to write certain
Mm.
things. Another interesting anecdote is we had an issue on birds, and I was like really excited about it. I was like, yeah, let's put together, don't ask me why, but I was like, oh, let's do a whole issue with nonfiction writing about birds or centered around birds. And that ended up being our widest issue, I think, like all
Oh.
of the writers. And it wasn't, and ever
Yeah.
since then I have, found other writing, right, by non-white writers about
Mm.
birds, because
Mm.
I've been very like looking for them, just because of that whole experience. And it was like, this is so strange, and I've heard it said too, right? That like nature writing in general tends to be, dominated by white writers. And then what is it, right? Is it the way we categorize that kind of writing? Is it the expectations for that kind of writing that is there writing about nature that doesn't fall into that particular style or tone that we've come to associate with nature writing that results us in declassifying it as nature writing? So then it becomes about, for example, maybe identity when it comes to First Nations writers, right? They're not writing about nature, they're writing about identity because they're writing about the relationship to country, or, so things like that, that I think are very interesting. And those have become, I guess, I've thought more about them as a result of my experience editing.
Which you would only see by having this overview. That you wouldn't make those distinctions without looking at all of those works being brought together. So it's like that gives you that ability to see. I'm going to ask Tiffany one or two more questions, and then I will open up for questions more generally. So please pop your questions in the chat box, and I'll get to as many of them as I can.
I think I saw one up here, Zita. You have written across a number. Oh, is it okay if I read it out?
Yeah, you go for it, Tiffany.
Oh, Tiffany.
I will come back to my questions.
Oh, right. Sorry, you were gonna. Sorry. No. Okay. No, I just got flustered. Ask me questions. Sorry. Okay.
Well, I just want to ask. Zita, we'll get to Zita's question, but I just did want to ask. In having read so many different articles and looked over articles that you were choosing, are there things that that you think stand out in an essay that makes it compelling, makes it something that you want to go back to, that you want, that people should read? Not should read, that's not really accurate.
I don't know. It's really hard to say because it just makes you, I think this experience has made me realize that good writing is good for all sorts of reasons. There are really just all sorts of reasons, right? Whether it be stylistically experimental, or whether it be, just really good, for example, fact finding or journalism, or whether it be just a really different approach or a really interesting topic or just a very unique voice. There's just so many things. There's no way to pin it down.
Yeah. And is there something that you think or is there a piece of writing that you to you stands the test of time, that is an example of great nonfiction writing?
So there's one piece that's really stuck with me, and we included it in one of the earlier issues, and it's just a piece of I guess journalism or long reportage by Melissa Lukashenko. It's called Sinking Below Sight, and it's actually paywalled by the Griffith Review, but people have been very nice, and when I've asked if the paywall can temporarily be taken down, they agree. But so that was, I think it originally came out in 2013, and that was an issue we did on class. And I just thought that was really quite fascinating. So interviewed three women, just living sort of poverty, below the poverty line, but also, having to deal with raising kids and just difficult domestic issues. And I just thought it was a really good, that was a really good piece. And, I don't, so, big fan of Melissa Lukashenko's work, but, just finding that particular piece, I was like, oh, this is really cool.
And that's an example of, someone who I think of, well, who's a fiction writer, and I would read her fiction, but then, and she's a very established name, but then for the circular to be able to direct people to non-fiction writing, to an essay that she's done, that's another important way to bring writing forward. So I will go to the audience questions, and you found the question from Zita asking, you've written across a number of genres. Is there a favorite one you, or one that you feel more comfortable with?
I don't know. I don't think so, because I think they just appeal to just different parts of me. I think we're like all very complex people, and so then there are just different things that bring out different things in you. So, for obviously the fantasy series, it's been a bit more lighthearted and a bit more obviously humorous. But yeah, it still tackles, certain issues that have been, that do preoccupy me. So there's still that vein in it. But it is kind of, it has, like I finished the third novel recently, and it was so nice to go into this world where, I don't know, like you just bounced back into it. And I was like, yeah, this is also a natural part of me. It didn't feel unnatural to write, that third book, or to write fantasy, in that more overt way. As you know, Under Your Wings or The Majesties is more dark, but it's still, I think it still had that speculative bent.
Yeah.
With the, I guess, sort of genetically engineered fungus and the insects and all of that. Yeah. So, that's always there, but I guess that one is more, I guess, my dark brooding side, I guess, sort of that comes out when I'm writing that kind of novel. And this next novel that I'm writing is also in that same vein. And that's the kind of novel where, I emerge out of it and I'm not necessarily happy. I'm more like depressed at the state of, so like, yeah, so it's just interesting. Yeah, I think it's just two different modes.
But it's interesting that when Zita asked about genres, and then you talking about The Majesties, The Majesties, I think, is quite hard to classify because it sort of has it's a thriller. It does have this speculative part to it. It's literary fiction. Like it's all of those things, which I think traditionally publishers, like things to fit into neat boxes, and it doesn't fit into a neat box.
Yes, that was an issue actually. I sense with the marketing, because I mean, like not being a marketer, I'm almost like, oh, I'll just write this thing and see what, but yeah, so it was classified as thriller, I guess. I think they classified it here as a literary thriller, but then I think they perhaps were like emphasizing the thriller aspects for sales reasons. But then I got this like whole spate of reviews on Goodreads, which was like, this is a very disappointing thriller. It's not thrilling enough. It's like, oh, it starts out strong and like, the narrator kills like 300 people, but then it's really boring after that. It gets into like family dynamics and all of that. And I was a bit like, oh, well, And then I was like, maybe I should just have started, increasing the number of people killed rather than.
I think it's a bit hard to top when you start out with 300 people killed in the first paragraph.
Yeah. So that was the general sense I could sense from the thriller heads, which was, like not enough kill, all downhill from the first massacre.
That is hard when things get put into a little box. When it's a much bigger book, it doesn't fit in a little box. There's another question here from Tina saying, hi, Tiffany, what led you to write about family secrets in The Majesties?
Yeah, I don't know. I just think I think maybe this is a common experience with families, like I've talked to my friends about it too. And it's like sort of similar things, like just discovering, you'll just be chatting with your dad or your mother or your grandfather, and then you'll like they'll just mention something and you'll be like, huh, what was that again? And then you'll, and then then you sort of unearth it more, and you're like, it's, I mean, sometimes it's not that they haven't been intentionally keeping it, but they're just like, oh, I just thought it was completely unremarkable that, and then they, begin saying something that just completely like makes you go like, what? Yeah, so I think I just thought that was like really interesting that, we can be so we think we know so well the people we know so well. And
Mm,
then you can never know anyone really that,
mm,
completely. Right.
mm, mm,
Yeah. And, just even thinking about my own family's history and like my grandfather, he told more stories about his life than my grandmother did. But, just even hearing like what he went through and all of that, like, like you realize like, oh, there's so much more to this person I just know as a grandfather.
mm,
Um, and there's all of this other stuff, right?
mm, 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 mm. I just want to go, I once again, I would just like to keep talking about the majesties forever, but I would just like to pull us back to the circular for a minute. You've had this first year, this, hopefully the first iteration of the circular. What are your main learnings from what you've done in this past year in regard to what's needed for in that sort of digital writing publishing space?
Mm, yeah. Do you mind rephrasing the question again?
Do you mean expressing it more clearly?
I know you're
Um,
trying to leave it open, but
well, what have you learned from working on this project about digital publishing of Australian work, and how do you see what do you see needs to be done next?
hmm um, not sure what needs to be done next.
Mm, mm,
But I will say that, one thing that has come out of this is I feel that my time at the circular has shown that there is, I think, a desire for community and humanity within the digital publishing space. And I think
mm,
maybe sometimes we not underplay that, but maybe we underestimate that desire that people have to just connect over really amazing work, right? And to appreciate it and to be able to bring it back and cherish it and
mm,
share it. All of those impulses I think are really really human.
mm,
But I think somehow maybe we've actually gotten trapped into a narrative where we say that that's not the case now.
mm,
And I don't know whether it is the case or not, but we've actually received quite a lot of like really wonderful encouragement and support, right, from
mm,
people from the literary community.
mm, mm,
And I think that's that's lovely. And I do wonder whether we then spin this narrative where we're more trapped than we think, I guess. So, so when we say like, oh, we're everything's curated by the algorithm, only,
mm,
outrageous or outrage inducing pieces or really
mm,
like, sort of edgy pieces or overtly edgy pieces get, playtime. But I think maybe we under then we underestimate our role in that, in being able to counter that or get, I guess, or
mm, mm,
and I think it can seem like that because it can look like a competition, right? Like, who gets more likes or who's, you know, um, publishing, like
mm,
but I think that's part of the, not the game, but it's the illusion, right? That is a very bad illusion
mm,
to buy into, right? When
mm,
we're actually, like, um, yeah, a community, an ecosystem. And
mm,
I'd say that I've come more in my experiences at the circular to regard, I guess, all of the publications and organizations and people writing great work out there as members of an ecosystem rather than,
mm,
like, and they all have their niche and like their specialty and what they're really good at and the particular types of pieces they publish. And it would be
mm,
really cool to just see more, I guess, yeah, being able to support each other. But,
mm,
there's lack of funds, lack of time, lack of
mm,
labor. And it's just been a really big pleasure to be part of an enterprise that our goal is to support other writers and other organizations, you know, and that's basically like why it exists. So it's been really nice from that perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's really lovely to hear that's you know, what you've seen out of it. There's just another question here from Suzanne. How many stories do you have in each issue of the circular?
Yeah, so we usually link to between 5 to 7 items or 5 to 8 items at a stretch, just because we like to keep it readable for people. And again, like, we're not publishing them, we're just linking to them. Yeah.
But what I found really helpful is that you have a little introduction to the piece. You know, you have a little you know, what's interesting about it, why you would want to read it. So it's not just, I mean, obviously it's not just here's a link, look at this, but they're very well crafted and clickbaity in the nicest way. You know, in that they make you, they entice you to want to read it.
Yeah, and I think I mean, that's, you know, like part of it as well, right? I think, you know, as someone who writes, right, you realize how much work goes into each piece of writing, I feel. And a really good piece of writing, you know, sometimes will take a lot of labor and a lot of effort and a lot of emotional labor as well, especially with some pieces. And I think, you know, it's always one's dream to say, like, you want this to connect with someone and you want someone to appreciate it, right? So I feel like it's almost like, you know, if you have a chance to, you know, set it off and say, like, this is really cool, everyone. I think, you know, that, I mean, yeah, I hope that brings people joy and, you know, helps the you know, maybe that it's nice that, you know, the writer realizes that their labor hasn't just been, you know, sort of had its like 10 seconds of fame and then, you know, disappeared into the ether, you know, which is sometimes how it can feel when you're writing online content, especially. It's like this treadmill. And
yeah. Well, I think the circular is circular in the nicest way, that it's, you know, so the effort is put into the writing, the effort is put into the discovering, and then there's this warmth and generosity in sharing the work again with other people. So, and that clearly, you know, it's obviously a broader team, but that your investment in that is very evident there. So I can't quite believe it, but we've already reached 1:30, which I'm shocked how quickly this has flown by. So thank you, Tiffany, for being here and for sharing with us about your work and particularly about the circular. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you. The next First Friday will be held on the 7th of October with Kate Mildenhall, who's an author and co-host of the First Time podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you at another Writing New South Wales event, whether that's in person or online. And thank you, Tiffany. It's just lovely talking to you.
No, thank you so much, Julia.
Pleasure.
Thanks for everyone who came.
Thank you. Bye.